On the second day of October in the year 1552, perched upon a commanding hill that surveyed the mighty Volga River below, an ancient city was being consumed by flames that reached toward the smoke-filled sky. Kazan, the proud capital and final remaining successor state of what had once been the incomparable Mongol Empire that had terrorized half the world, was crumbling and collapsing in a blazing inferno that turned day into night with its smoke. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the screams of dying men, the clash of steel on steel, the crackling of flames devouring wooden buildings that had stood for generations. Within the city's formidable walls, 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen, warriors of legendary skill and fearsome reputation, who had never known defeat on their home ground, fought with desperate courage to their very last breath, knowing that surrender meant death or slavery. Outside those same walls, 150,000 Russian troops surged forward like an unstoppable tide of iron and flesh, pouring through massive breaches that had been violently blasted open by weaponry the world had never witnessed before, the destructive power of massed gunpowder on a scale previously unimaginable. And there, observing it all as it unfolded before his eyes from a safe vantage point, stood a young man of merely 22 years with burning intensity in his gaze, Ivan IV, whom the annals of history would forever remember by the chilling epithet, the Terrible. But this account is not merely a story about a single battle, however pivotal it may have been. This is the remarkable story of how a relatively small nation finally managed to break free from the long, oppressive shadow of the Mongol Empire after enduring 3 full centuries of subjugation, and how it took its very first steps toward eventually becoming the largest country on Earth by geographical area. The fundamental question that demands our attention is this: how did a young Tsar, barely out of his adolescence, manage to defeat a power that had dominated, controlled, and terrorized Russia for 300 years? And in what ways did this single, momentous decision change the entire course of history, not just for Russia, but for the world? Drop a comment down below and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it happens to be for you right now. And now, let's journey back together to the year 1552 to truly understand why the Battle of Kazan mattered so profoundly, why it represented such a watershed moment in history that historians still debate its significance today. We need to travel back in time to the 13th century and understand the full weight of what Russia had endured. In the year 1237, when Batu Khan's fearsome Mongol cavalry swept across the endless steppes like a devastating storm, descending upon the Russian lands with unimaginable fury and speed that no European army could match, they didn't simply conquer Russia in any conventional military sense. They absolutely crushed it, ground it into dust, destroyed its very foundations. The Russian principalities, fragmented and disunited, quarreling among themselves instead of standing together, were burned to ash and cinders. Kiev, the very heart and soul of Slavic civilization, the mother of Russian cities where Christianity had first been adopted, where culture and learning had flourished, was completely leveled, razed to the ground with a thoroughness that shocked even hardened warriors who had seen countless sieges. Contemporary chronicles describe streets running with blood, churches filled with corpses, treasures looted and carried away. and for the next 240 years, spanning nearly a dozen generations where no living person could remember freedom, Russian princes knelt in submission before the Khans of the Golden Horde, bowing their heads in enforced humility, their pride crushed beneath the Mongol yoke. This wasn't just military occupation in any ordinary sense of the term. This was total, complete, and absolute domination, economic, political, psychological, and spiritual. Every single year, without exception, Russian princes had to bring tribute to Sarai, the glittering capital of the Golden Horde, carrying gold, silver, furs, and other valuable goods as symbols of their subordination. They had to humbly ask permission to rule their own ancestral lands, to make decisions about their own territories, and whenever the Khan wished it, whenever his mood turned dark or his coffers ran low, Mongol horsemen would appear on the horizon like a nightmare made flesh, raiding settlements, looting towns and villages, taking people, men, women, and children, as slaves to be sold in distant markets. The terror was constant, unending, a sword hanging perpetually over every Russian head. But by the 15th century, after nearly 200 years of dominance, the Golden Horde began to fragment and fracture from within. Succession wars between rival claimants to the throne, declining military power as the old ways became less effective, internal corruption and external pressures all took their toll. And from the shattered wreckage of this once mighty empire, 3 new khanates emerged as independent powers: Crimea in the south, Astrakhan near the Caspian Sea, and Kazan along the Volga River. Of these 3 successor states, Kazan represented by far the greatest and most immediate threat to Moscow. Why? The answer lies in a single word: location. Kazan sat in a position of enormous strategic importance right on the Volga River, the absolute lifeline of trade and military power in the region. From their imposing fortress perched on a high hill, they controlled everything and everyone moving between Moscow and the Eastern Territories. And perhaps even more importantly, Kazan had preserved and maintained Mongol military culture in its purest form. Tatar cavalry, trained from childhood in the ancient ways, remained the most feared warriors on the steppes, masters of mounted combat and swift raids. From its founding in the year 1438 to 1552, a span of over a century, Russian forces attempted to conquer Kazan at least 10 separate times. 10 times they mustered their armies, marched toward the fortress city, and laid siege to its walls. And 10 times, without exception, they failed and retreated in defeat and frustration. The attacks usually followed a depressingly similar pattern, a cycle of hope followed by disappointment. Russian troops would arrive with high spirits and determination, lay siege to the city, bombard it with whatever artillery they possessed for a few weeks or perhaps a month, and then inevitably retreat due to critical supply problems, disease, or because swift Tatar cavalry had hit their vulnerable supply lines, cutting them off from reinforcements and provisions. Each failure reinforced the growing belief: Kazan seemed utterly invincible, protected by geography, military skill, and perhaps even fate itself. But in the year 1547, a determined 17-year-old boy decided with absolute conviction that he would change that pattern forever. His birth name was Ivan Vasilievich, but history would come to know him by another, far more ominous name: Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV wasn't like other princes, wasn't like the careful politicians and cautious rulers who had come before him, men who had learned to survive by bending with the wind. He became Grand Prince at the tender age of 3 years old, following his father Vasily III's sudden and unexpected death from what was likely blood poisoning from an infected leg wound. And what happened next, during his formative childhood years, when character is forged, shaped, and molded, the man Ivan would eventually become in ways both profound and disturbing, creating psychological scars that would never fully heal. Instead of being properly protected and carefully educated as befitted a young prince, as should have been his right and expectation, as his father would have wanted, young Ivan was forced to watch helplessly as the noble families, the proud and arrogant boyars with their ancient names and sense of entitlement, fought viciously for power around the throne like wolves circling wounded prey, treating the child ruler as an irrelevance, a puppet to be manipulated. They neglected him shamefully, sometimes denying him food when it pleased them, even abused him both physically and emotionally, treating him with contempt that no prince should have to endure. Stories survive of young Ivan being left in tattered clothes, while boyars dressed in finery taken from the royal treasury. Meanwhile, these same nobles lived in luxury and indulgence on state resources, hosting lavish feasts, while the young prince went hungry, enriching themselves and their families at the expense of the realm, treating Russia's wealth as their personal property. Ivan grew up in an atmosphere of constant fear and crushing loneliness, never knowing whom to trust, always aware of the knives being sharpened in the shadows, learning that power was the only thing that mattered in this world. He developed a taste for cruelty early. Contemporary accounts mention him throwing dogs from the Kremlin walls, watching them die, finding some outlet for his powerlessness. This wasn't the behavior of a normal child, but of one warped by trauma. But along with that fear and loneliness and emerging cruelty grew something else, an iron determination, a will forged in the fires of hardship that would have broken lesser men. He made a vow to himself, a promise he would never break. He would never allow this to happen to Russia again, would never allow boyars to treat rulers with such contempt. He would make Russia strong, powerful, respected, and feared by all nations. He would end the nation's dependence on anyone, whether Mongol Khans who demanded tribute or arrogant boyars who thought themselves above the throne. And the greatest immediate threat to that vision, the symbol of everything that kept Russia weak and subordinate and humiliated, was Kazan, the last remnant of the empire that had broken Russia centuries ago. In 1547, at just 16 years of age, Ivan did something completely unprecedented in Russian history, something that shocked the boyars and foreign observers alike. He declared himself Tsar, from the Roman Caesar, meaning emperor of all Russia, not merely Grand Prince anymore, as his predecessors had been. Tsar. This was a bold, audacious declaration of absolute power, a claim to authority that placed him on the same level as the Byzantine emperors of old. And immediately, without hesitation, Ivan turned his full attention to the problem of Kazan. But Ivan, young as he was, possessed wisdom beyond his years. He knew instinctively that the old methods, the traditional approaches that had failed 10 times before, wouldn't work now simply because he willed them to. Russian forces had failed 10 times using conventional tactics. He needed something completely new, a revolutionary approach. Ivan's first campaigns in 1547 and 1549 to 1550, following more or less traditional patterns, both ended in failure, just like those that came before. But unlike his predecessors, unlike the cautious men who had given up after one or two attempts, Ivan didn't surrender to despair. Instead, he learned from each setback, analyzed each mistake with ruthless honesty. He came to a crucial realization. The problem wasn't the courage of his soldiers, who had proven their bravery again and again. The problem wasn't even lack of numbers. The problem was logistics, how to supply an army in hostile territory, and technology, how to break walls that had stood for over a century. To successfully conquer Kazan, Ivan needed three specific things, three elements that had been missing from every previous attempt. First, a forward base near the target to solve the supply problem. Second, modern siege weapons that could actually breach the formidable walls. And third, a professional army rather than feudal levies. And this is when Ivan began the careful, meticulous preparations for the battle that would fundamentally change the course of history. In the year 1551, something extraordinarily strange and unprecedented happened on the Volga River, something that confused and alarmed the defenders of Kazan when scouts brought word of it. From the distant city of Uglich, far upstream hundreds of kilometers away, thousands upon thousands of numbered logs began floating down the river in an organized procession that went on for weeks, an endless train of timber moving steadily downstream with the current. These weren't ordinary logs cut for construction or firewood, randomly selected from nearby forests. They were carefully measured and precisely cut parts of a prefabricated fortress, each piece marked with identifying numbers and symbols carved or burned into the wood so workers would know exactly where each piece belonged. The military engineer Ivan Virodov, a man of exceptional skill and innovative vision, who understood both traditional carpentry and modern military engineering, had designed a complete wooden fortress with all its walls, towers, gates, and internal structures, then methodically disassembled the entire structure, numbered every single piece so it could be reconstructed correctly without confusion, and organized the transportation of these components approximately 900 kilometers downstream in one of the most impressive logistical operations of the 16th century. When this massive shipment of lumber finally reached its destination, positioned strategically just 18 kilometers from Kazan, close enough to threaten the city and cut its communication lines, but far enough to avoid immediate assault from the garrison, Russian troops and laborers, working from detailed plans, reassembled it over the course of several weeks, following Virodov's detailed plans and using the sophisticated numbering system. Each piece fit perfectly into place like a giant puzzle. They named this impressive new fortification Sviazhsk, and it would serve as the cornerstone of Ivan's strategy. This wasn't just an impressive engineering feat that demonstrated Russian technical capabilities, though it certainly was that, and observers from across Europe would later marvel at it. It was strategic genius of the highest order, a masterstroke of military planning that solved problems that had plagued every previous campaign. For the first time in Russian history, for the first time in over a century of failed attempts, Moscow had a solid, permanent base near Kazan, a secure place to store mountains of supplies and weapons, a location that could serve as a staging point for attacks and as a refuge if tactical retreat became necessary. No more worrying about dangerously long and vulnerable supply lines stretching back hundreds of kilometers to Moscow through potentially hostile territory. No more abandoning sieges when provisions ran out after a few weeks. Sviajsk meant the Russians could sustain operations indefinitely, could outlast the defenders no matter how determined they were. But Ivan, ever thorough and always planning several moves ahead, didn't stop there with just the fortress. He knew with certainty that traditional Russian military forces, feudal cavalry units where each noble brought his own poorly trained men, warriors whose primary loyalty was to their lord rather than to the state, simply weren't sufficient for the task ahead. These feudal levies lacked discipline, coordinated training, and unified command. They were effective enough for border raids and small-scale conflicts, but utterly inadequate for a massive siege against a prepared enemy. So Ivan created something genuinely new, something revolutionary for Russia, the Streltsy. This was Russia's first standing army of professional musketeers, soldiers who served the state full-time. These weren't part-time warriors who farmed most of the year. These were men who were paid regular salaries, professionally trained in military tactics and the use of firearms, and most importantly of all, loyal directly to the Tsar rather than to individual nobles who might have their own agendas. The Streltsy were equipped with arquebuses, the most advanced firearms of that era, weapons that could kill armored warriors at distances far beyond bow range. They drilled constantly, practicing formations and fire discipline. They represented a new kind of warfare, one based on discipline and firepower rather than individual courage and noble birth. And then there was artillery, the siege weapons that would ultimately decide the battle. Ivan hired the finest experts from Western Europe, especially skilled engineers from Italy and Germany, men who understood modern siege warfare with all its complexities and techniques. He assembled an impressive force of 150 cannons, a massive concentration of artillery firepower by the standards of the time, more guns than had ever been gathered in Russia before. But the truly decisive weapon in Ivan's arsenal wasn't a cannon or a gun. It was a man named Butler, likely an English engineer whom the Russians called Rozmysl, meaning the wise one or the clever one. He was a master expert in a relatively new and devastating technology, mining, digging tunnels beneath walls, and using massive amounts of gunpowder to blow them up from below. By June of 1552, after months of intensive preparation, everything was ready. Ivan had learned comprehensively from all the previous failures. Now he didn't just have a larger army than his predecessors had commanded. He had a better army with superior technology, modern tactics, and most importantly, a comprehensive plan that addressed every weakness that had caused previous sieges to fail. On June 16, 1552, Ivan IV, still only 22 years old, led 150,000 troops toward Kazan in the largest military operation Russia had ever mounted. This would be attempt number 11 to conquer the city, but this time everything would be different. On August 22, 1552, when the massive Russian army appeared below Kazan's imposing walls, the Tatar defenders weren't initially afraid or even particularly concerned. This was familiar to them. They'd successfully repelled Russian forces 10 times before over the past century. Why would this 11th attempt be any different from all the others? They had confidence born of experience. Kazan sat majestically atop a high hill, protected by thick wooden walls reinforced with earth, with a deep moat surrounding the fortifications that would slow any assault. Inside the walls, there were ample supplies carefully stockpiled for months of siege, a secret underground water source that had saved them in previous sieges, and 10,000 Tatar warriors, the finest, most feared cavalry in the entire world, men who had trained for war since childhood. Khan Yadigar Muhammad, ruler of Kazan, even sent a contemptuous message to Ivan, displaying the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. "Everything is ready for you here. We invite you to the feast." It was a taunt, an insult, an expression of complete confidence that the Russians would be destroyed as they had been before. But what happened next surprised and confused the defenders. Instead of the expected direct assault, the traditional Russian approach of immediately throwing troops at the walls in costly attacks, Russian forces began systematically digging trenches. They constructed zigzag trenches that slowly approached the city, moving closer day by day. This was a sophisticated technique called approaches that had been developed in Europe but had never been seen before on the Russian steppes. It was slower than direct assault, but it saved lives and allowed steady progress. Meanwhile, the engineer Ivan Virodov was constructing something truly remarkable, something no one in Russia had ever seen before, something that would be talked about in military circles across Europe once word of it spread. A battery tower of unprecedented design and ambition that would revolutionize siege warfare. This wasn't a traditional wooden siege tower of the kind that had been used since ancient Roman times, the simple platforms on wheels that archers used to shoot over walls. This was a 12-meter-high, multi-tiered engineering structure, a marvel of military architecture and carpentry designed specifically to carry and support heavy artillery, something wooden structures normally couldn't do without collapsing under the weight and recoil. The top platform of this tower could hold 10 heavy cannons, massive guns weighing hundreds of pounds each that would normally require ground-level positions with earth buttresses to absorb recoil. Lower levels could accommodate 50 lighter guns, smaller caliber pieces but still deadly, and dozens of musketeers protected by wooden shields who could provide covering fire. The structural engineering required to support this weight while remaining stable was extraordinary. The strategic idea behind this innovation was concentrated firepower, a principle that would dominate military thinking for centuries. 60 cannons all firing simultaneously at the exact same point on the wall, creating a focus of destructive force that no fortification, no matter how well built, could withstand for long. Stone would crack, wood would splinter, earth would crumble. This tower was the ancestor of modern artillery fortifications, and its design was truly revolutionary, representing a leap forward in military engineering that would influence siege warfare for generations to come. But there was a significant problem with this ambitious plan that threatened to ruin everything. Kazan possessed cannons too, heavy guns of their own mounted on the walls and manned by experienced gunners. If the Tatar gunners managed to destroy the tower during its construction phase, when it was most vulnerable and before it could be properly defended, everything would be over. The massive investment of time, precious materials, and strategic advantage would be lost in a moment, destroyed by a lucky shot. The entire plan depended on this tower reaching its final position intact, so construction of the tower happened primarily at night under cover of darkness, hidden behind temporary protective walls and screens. And meanwhile, Russian artillery throughout the siege lines had one primary crucial mission: silence Kazan's guns, destroy their cannon positions, kill their gunners. On August 29th, after a full week of sustained, focused bombardment that never let the defenders rest, the Russian gunners succeeded in their objective. Kazan's heavy cannons, battered and dismounted, went quiet. Their gunners were dead or wounded, their positions destroyed. Now the battery tower could be safely moved into its final position without fear of destruction. But just when everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan, just when victory seemed to be drawing closer, nature itself intervened against the besiegers. Terrible storms swept across the region, unusual for the season. Torrential rain fell day after day, turning the entire Russian camp into a muddy swamp where men struggled to walk and horses sank to their knees. Tents blew away in howling winds. Supply wagons became mired in the deep mud. Morale plummeted among soldiers who were cold, wet, and miserable. Some Russian soldiers, men raised in a world where the supernatural seemed very real, began to believe that this weather was unnatural, that it was black magic, that Tatar sorcerers were summoning bad weather through dark rituals and ancient spells to drive them away. Even the historical chronicles of the time, written by educated monks, mention mysterious magicians of Kazan appearing on the walls each morning at dawn, performing strange rituals and gestures toward the Russian lines. Even responded to this crisis of morale with religious symbolism. He brought forth a crucifix that was said to contain an actual fragment of the true cross from Jerusalem, one of Christianity's most sacred relics. Orthodox priests blessed the entire camp, marching through the mud and conducting prayers. And whether by coincidence, natural weather patterns, or divine intervention, depending on one's beliefs, the storms gradually cleared. The sun emerged. The ground began to dry. Morale recovered. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, completely invisible to the defenders on the walls, another battle was silently unfolding. Specialized mining teams, working in darkness and danger, were quietly digging tunnels toward the walls, moving tons of earth, shoring up passages with timber to prevent collapses. Their first specific target was identified by intelligence, or perhaps by chance: Kazan's underground water supply system. The city had constructed an ingenious secret underground water system, channels and cisterns that collected and stored water. This remarkable engineering was precisely why Kazan could endure long sieges, while other cities quickly surrendered when their wells ran dry. Water is life, especially in a siege. But Rosmissel, the English engineer with his specialized knowledge, found this underground system through careful surveying and probing. On August 30th, a sudden explosion rang out, echoing across the battlefield. The underground water supply was destroyed in a single devastating blast. The carefully constructed channels collapsed and contaminated. Now every single drop of water remaining in Kazan had to be carefully rationed among thousands of defenders and civilians. Thirst would become an enemy as dangerous as cannon fire. The massive battery tower was finally pushed and pulled into its optimal position, close enough to the walls to be devastatingly effective. And from its impressive 12-meter height, Commanding views over the battlefield, 60 cannons began pounding the same carefully selected section of wall continuously hour after hour, day after day, never giving the defenders time to repair the damage. Stone cracked, wood splintered, the wall began to crumble. Inside the city, conditions became increasingly desperate with each passing day. No fresh water, food supplies running dangerously low, casualties mounting, and every single day, relentlessly, the walls were being methodically ground down, reduced to rubble by the unceasing bombardment. Khan Yadigar Muhammad, still defiant despite the deteriorating situation, refused all offers to surrender. When Ivan sent captured Tatar prisoners back to the city carrying peace offers and terms of surrender, offering to spare lives if the city yielded, the defenders on the walls shot their own countrymen with arrows rather than listen to talk of surrender. They would rather see their own people die quickly than imagine what slow torture and slavery might await them in defeat. This was resistance driven by desperation and pride. But Ivan hadn't yet deployed his truly decisive weapon, the secret advantage that would win the battle in a single morning. Underground, hidden from all observers, mining teams had spent weeks digging complex and extensive tunnel networks right beneath the main walls and gates of the city, working in shifts around the clock. At key strategic points, they had created large chambers, rooms carved from earth and rock. And these chambers were methodically filled with gunpowder, barrels and barrels of it, tons of explosive powder. On September 30th, after final inspections and careful preparation, everything was ready for the decisive moment. A series of fuses were connected with meticulous care, creating an intricate network that would trigger multiple explosions in rapid sequence. The strategic idea was brilliant. Create a cascade of explosions, one after another in quick succession, that would simultaneously destroy the foundations of the walls at multiple critical points, creating numerous breaches that couldn't possibly all be defended at once. On the morning of October 2nd, 1552, a morning that would change history, Ivan gave the order. The signal was passed. The fuses were lit. The first explosion sounded like thunder from the heavens, a roar that shook the earth and could be heard for miles. An entire massive section of wall near the Arsk Gate was blown into the air, stones and timber flying skyward before raining down on terrified defenders. Then another tremendous explosion erupted near the Nogai Gate, equally devastating. Then another and another. The ground trembled with each blast. When the dust and smoke finally settled enough to see, when ears stopped ringing from the concussive force, there were 3 massive breaches in Kazan's supposedly impregnable walls. And 150,000 Russian troops, who had been waiting in formation for this exact moment, began their advance toward the city. What happened next was one of the most brutal, savage, and desperate urban battles of the entire 16th century. Combat of a ferocity that shocked even hardened warriors. Russian forces poured through the breaches like an unstoppable flood, thousands of soldiers funneling through the gaps in the walls. But Kazan's defenders, even facing this catastrophe, didn't run away or immediately surrender as might have been expected. They fought fiercely in every street, every house, every narrow alley, selling their lives as dearly as possible. This was the last desperate stand of an entire culture watching its end unfold, knowing that defeat meant not just political subjugation, but potentially the extinction of their way of life. Tatar cavalry, feared throughout the region as the most fearsome warriors on the open steppes, where their speed and mobility made them nearly invincible, were now trapped and confined in narrow city streets, where their traditional advantages meant nothing. They couldn't use their legendary speed and fluid mobility, couldn't execute the sweeping mounted charges that had won countless battles. But still they fought with desperate courage, fighting on foot when their horses were killed, wielding swords when their bows broke. Civilians, men, women, even children, grabbed whatever weapons or implements they could find and joined the fight, knowing that surrender meant slavery or death. They threw stones and bricks from rooftops, hoping to crack skulls. They poured boiling oil from windows onto soldiers below, causing horrible injuries. They knew with certainty that if the city fell completely, everything they had ever known would end forever. Their language might be forbidden, their religion might be suppressed, their children might be taken away. They were fighting for cultural survival, and they were right to fear. The Streltsy, Ivan's professionally trained musketeers who had drilled endlessly for exactly this kind of combat, advanced through each district with cold, methodical, deadly discipline. They shot defenders from distances where traditional Tatar close combat skills, sword fighting, wrestling, dagger work, were far less effective. The arquebuses gave them an enormous advantage in urban fighting. They could kill without closing to sword range. In Kazan's main mosque, the spiritual heart of the city, a courageous religious leader named Kol Sharif and his devoted students made a heroic final stand that would be remembered in Tatar folklore. They turned the madrasa, the Islamic religious school where they had taught theology and law and poetry, into a makeshift fortress and fought to the absolute last man, defending every room, every doorway. Kol Sharif died defending his sacred library, surrounded by ancient manuscripts and texts, choosing death over the desecration of knowledge. By the afternoon of October 2nd, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Khan Yadigar Muhammad, wounded and exhausted, was finally captured. Soon after, the leading Nogai generals, seeing that all was lost, also surrendered to save the lives of their remaining men. Some survivors attempted desperately to flee to the northern forests, hoping to escape and perhaps organize resistance. But they were systematically hunted down by Russian cavalry and killed. Others retreated into the inner citadel, the last strongpoint, but there was no realistic hope of relief or escape. It was merely choosing where to die. By sunset on October 2nd, 1552, Kazan had fallen completely. What happened next was brutal even by the harsh standards of the 16th century, when warfare was already merciless. A massive massacre ensued, Russian soldiers killing anyone who resisted and many who didn't, caught up in the bloodlust of victory. Most Tatar buildings were systematically destroyed. Mosques were burned, their minarets pulled down, their decorated interiors smashed. But there were also moments of humanity and mercy amidst the horror. Between 60,000 and 100,000 Russian prisoners and slaves, people captured in raids over many years, sometimes decades, were freed from bondage. Many of these freed captives had been held for so long that they had forgotten how to speak Russian properly, their childhood language lost. Some had been taken as children and were now middle-aged. Their joy at liberation was profound. Ivan, according to the historical records kept by court chroniclers, wasn't personally present in the street fighting, didn't participate in the final assault with sword in hand. According to these chronicles, he remained in his tent outside the walls, praying throughout the entire battle, on his knees before icons. Some historians interpret this as wisdom and appropriate behavior. A tsar shouldn't needlessly risk his life in the chaos of urban combat, where a single arrow or sword stroke could kill him as easily as any common soldier. Others suggest more critically that Ivan was afraid, that he lacked personal physical courage despite his strategic boldness. But what mattered most in the final analysis wasn't where Ivan physically was during those crucial hours, but rather what he had achieved through his planning and determination. After 42 days of siege, after 114 years of existence as an independent Khanate, after centuries as a center of Mongol Tatar power on the Volga River, the seemingly unconquerable city of Kazan had fallen. On October 4th, 2 days after the final assault, Ivan entered the conquered city, walking through streets still littered with bodies. He gave orders immediately that an Orthodox church be built on the ashes of the main mosque, a symbolic replacement of one faith with another. And he decreed that a new symbol would be placed on Russian churches throughout his realm, a cross standing triumphantly atop an Islamic crescent moon. The religious and political message was clear and unmistakable. The last Mongol Empire had been decisively defeated. The conquerors had become the conquered. But the story doesn't end there with military victory and religious symbolism. In fact, the fall of Kazan was just beginning, not ending, a story. Because the conquest of this single city wasn't just a military victory to be celebrated and then forgotten. It was a genuine turning point in world history, one of those rare moments where you can definitively say, before this event, the world was one way. After this event, the world was fundamentally different. Let me explain precisely why this matters so much. The victory at Kazan proved something crucial, something that would reshape military thinking. European military technology, cannons, sophisticated siege engineering, professional armies with firearms, was decisively superior to traditional steppe warfare tactics. For centuries, going back to the time of Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol Tatar cavalry had dominated battlefields across Asia and Europe with their speed, mobility, and mounted archery tactics. But against fortified walls, against modern cannons, against disciplined formations of musketeers, that traditional advantage disappeared completely. Mobility meant nothing against walls. Archery meant nothing against cannon range. Individual warrior skill meant nothing against disciplined volleys. This is exactly why, after Kazan demonstrated the effectiveness of this new military approach, the other Khanates quickly fell like dominoes. In 1556, just 4 years later, Astrakhan was conquered by Russian forces using similar tactics. A few decades later, Sibir, the last surviving Khanate east of the Urals, also collapsed. The entire age of steppe empires, which had dominated Eurasian history for centuries, was over. A new age of gunpowder empires was beginning. With Kazan conquered in 1552 and later Astrakhan in 1556 under firm Russian control, the entire Volga River from its source to its mouth was now Russian territory. This was the single most important trade route in Eastern Europe, and now Moscow controlled every kilometer of it. This geographic control opened lucrative trade routes with Persia via the Caspian Sea. It opened routes to Central Asia and its fabled cities. And most importantly, for Russia's future, it opened the path to Siberia and its unimaginable wealth in furs. Just 3 decades after Kazan fell, Russian fur trappers, merchants, and Cossack adventurers began crossing the Ural Mountains in significant numbers. By 1639, less than a century after the fall of Kazan, Russian explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean on the far side of Asia. They had crossed the entire Asian continent in roughly the same amount of time it took other European nations to explore and map a single African or American coastline. The speed of this expansion was unprecedented in human history. This is the fundamental reason why Russia today is the largest country in the world, by geographical area, spanning 11 time zones. It all can be traced directly back to the conquest of Kazan in 1552. But perhaps the most profound and lasting consequence was about identity, about how Russians saw themselves and their place in the world, about the very meaning of being Russian. For 300 years, nearly a dozen generations where grandparents told their grandchildren stories of subjugation, Russia had been dominated by Mongol Tatar Muslim powers who treated Slavic Christians as inferiors. Moscow's grand princes had to kneel before the Khan in humiliating ceremonies, a constant reminder of subordination. They paid tribute that impoverished their lands and prevented development. They asked permission for decisions that should have been theirs to make freely: whom to marry, where to build churches, how to collect taxes. Every aspect of sovereignty was compromised. With Kazan's conquest, that entire relationship reversed completely and permanently. For the first time in living memory, for the first time in centuries beyond anyone's grandfather's memory, Moscow was no longer subordinate to anyone. For the first time, Russians became the conquerors rather than the conquered, the masters rather than the subjects, the ones who gave orders rather than took them. For the first time, they could hold their heads high among European nations. And for the first time, the Russian state transformed fundamentally from a relatively homogeneous principality of Orthodox Slavs into a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that would become the defining characteristic of Russia for centuries to come. Kazan brought under Russian rule dozens of different peoples with different languages, customs, and worldviews. Tatars with their Turkic language and Islamic faith, Chuvash with their unique tongue, Mari with their shamanistic traditions, Udmurt, Bashkir, and many others whose names are less known but whose lives were equally transformed. Some were Muslim, following the faith of their Mongol conquerors. Some followed ancestral shamanistic religions, worshipping spirits of forest and river. Some practiced forms of Christianity different from Russian Orthodoxy. Now they all lived under Moscow's rule, whether they wished it or not, whether they had been consulted or not, their fates decided by a distant czar they had never seen. This is why some historians argue persuasively that October 2nd, 1552, should be considered the true birth date of the multicultural Russian Empire as we know it today, the moment when Russia stopped being merely a nation of one people and became an empire of many peoples. Everything that followed, the conquest of Siberia with its dozens of indigenous tribes, the expansion into the Caucasus with its mosaic of ethnicities and religions, the incorporation of Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states, the creation of a state spanning a sixth of the world's land surface. All of it traces back to this moment when Russia first learned to rule over peoples different from itself. But there was also a very dark side to this story, aspects that are uncomfortable to remember, but must be acknowledged if we're to understand the full truth of what happened, not just the triumphalist version. Kazan's Muslim population was forcibly expelled from the city center after the conquest, driven from their homes at bayonet point, with nothing but what they could carry, forced to resettle in less desirable areas or leave entirely. The beautiful mosques that had stood for over a century, architectural marvels that combined Islamic and local traditions in unique ways, were systematically destroyed, burned to the ground, or forcibly converted into Orthodox churches with crosses replacing crescents. The call of the muezzin, which had echoed across the city 5 times daily for generations, calling the faithful to prayer, was silenced forever. A campaign of forced conversion to Orthodox Christianity began almost immediately, with priests following in the army's wake, though it wasn't entirely successful due to covert resistance by people who secretly maintained their faith despite outward conformity to save their lives and property. And for the Tatars, for the ordinary people who had lived in Kazan and the surrounding territories, this wasn't a glorious triumph of civilization over barbarism, as Russian chronicles portrayed it, wasn't progress or liberation, or the victory of light over darkness. This was the end of their independent state, something they had built and defended for over a century, the last remnant of the great empire their ancestors had created. This was the beginning of centuries of living under foreign rule, of cultural suppression, where speaking their language too loudly might mark them as suspicious or rebellious, of being treated as second-class subjects in what had been their own homeland, of watching their children educated in Russian schools that taught them to be ashamed of their heritage and to see Russian culture as superior. The psychological wound of conquest, the trauma of subjugation, would pass from generation to generation, kept alive in family stories and quiet remembrance even when official expression was dangerous. Even today, 5 full centuries later, on October 15th in the modern calendar, October 2nd in the old Julian calendar that was used in 1552, some Tatars in the modern Russian Republic of Tatarstan quietly mark the day of remembrance and sorrow, commemorating those who died defending Kazan, remembering the last days of independence before the city fell. The Russian government banned public rallies on this day in 2021, fearing nationalist sentiment and separatist tendencies that might threaten the unity of the Russian Federation. But the memory persists stubbornly in private observances, in family stories passed down through generations from grandmother to grandchild, in poetry and songs that keep alive what official history tries to bury or reframe as liberation. History, as always, is complex and multifaceted, refusing to fit neatly into simple narratives of progress or decline, good versus evil. One person's victory is invariably another person's tragedy. One nation's Independence Day, celebrated with flags and fireworks and patriotic speeches about freedom, is another nation's day of mourning, observed with candles and tears and quiet grief for what was lost and can never be recovered. Ivan returned to Moscow in absolute glory, the conquering hero who had achieved what 10 previous attempts over more than a century had failed to accomplish. The streets were lined with cheering crowds who threw flowers and waved banners, Church bells rang throughout the city. News that his wife Anastasia had given birth to a son, an heir to continue his dynasty, added to the general joy and celebration sweeping through the capital. Though the boy, named Dmitri, didn't live long, dying in infancy as so tragically many children did in that harsh era before modern medicine, Ivan was welcomed as a hero by crowds who lined the streets for miles, people who saw in him the promise of a new Russia, strong and independent. He had proven that Russia could stand against its ancient enemy and win, that the days of submission were truly over. And to commemorate his historic victory for all time, to create a monument that would last centuries, Ivan commissioned and built one of the most famous and recognizable buildings in all of Russian history. St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square in Moscow, right in the heart of the city where everyone would see it. With its colorful, oddly shaped domes that seem to defy conventional architectural logic and gravity itself, each one different from the others in color and pattern, the cathedral was a fascinating and unique fusion of Russian architectural traditions and Eastern Islamic elements borrowed from the conquered territories. It was a physical symbol, visible to all who saw it and impossible to ignore, of the new multicultural empire Russia had become, combining visual elements from both conqueror and conquered, Russian and Tatar, Orthodox and Islamic, into something entirely new. But Ivan's personal story doesn't have a happy ending, doesn't conclude with contentment and peace and a long, prosperous reign. In the years after Kazan, as Ivan aged and faced new challenges both domestic and foreign, he became increasingly brutal, paranoid, and mentally unstable, possibly suffering from what we today might recognize as severe mental illness. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state, a secret police force of fanatically loyal men dressed in black who terrorized the entire country, confiscating property from suspected enemies, executing supposed traitors often on the flimsiest of evidence or merely on suspicion. He killed thousands of people in fits of paranoid rage, imagining conspiracies everywhere, seeing enemies in every shadow, trusting no one completely. And in a moment of uncontrolled fury in 1581, during a heated argument about his daughter-in-law's clothing, which he deemed immodest, he struck his own eldest son Ivan with his pointed iron-tipped staff, hitting him in the temple. The young man, the heir apparent to the throne and the hope for the dynasty's future, died from catastrophic injuries days later. Ivan the Terrible spent the rest of his life consumed by overwhelming guilt and remorse for this act. That's why we call him the Terrible, understanding that the Russian word Grozny means not just terrible, but awesome, formidable, inspiring dread. Not just for his power and achievements, but for his cruelty and instability. But that complicated, tragic personal story is material for another video, another day. Today, right now, we need to focus on the lessons that this history teaches us. 3 lessons from Kazan. So after everything we've discussed, after this journey through history, what are the lasting lessons we should take away? I think there are 3 fundamental truths that emerge from this story. Lessons that apply not just to 16th century warfare, but to our lives today. First lesson, adapt or become irrelevant. For centuries upon centuries, military advantage in warfare belonged exclusively to those with the fastest cavalry, the most skilled archers trained from childhood, the most mobile forces that could strike and vanish before enemies could respond. the Mongols built history's greatest contiguous land empire, based precisely on that advantage, conquering everything from China to Hungary on horseback, creating an empire larger than Alexander's or Rome's at its peak. Their mounted archers could ride for days without rest, shoot accurately from galloping horses, coordinate massive movements across vast distances. They seemed invincible, unstoppable, a force of nature rather than mere men. But when technology fundamentally changed, when cannons, firearms, and modern siege engineering appeared and became dominant through European innovation and experimentation, the entire equation shifted overnight. What was once invincible, the mounted archer, the swift raid, the mobility that had conquered half the world, suddenly became vulnerable, even obsolete. A peasant with a musket and 2 weeks of training could kill a master horseman who had trained his entire life. A well-built fortress could withstand cavalry charges that would have swept away earlier defenses. Technology had changed the very nature of power. This principle isn't just true in warfare and military history, though it's dramatically illustrated there. It's equally true in business, in technology, in our personal careers and lives. What worked yesterday, what made you successful in the past and brought you status and wealth, might not work tomorrow and could leave you helpless. The world changes constantly. Technology evolves at an accelerating pace. Markets shift. Customer needs transform. The ability to adapt, to learn new skills even when they seem strange or unnecessary, to embrace new ideas and methods even when they challenge everything you thought you knew, determines survival and success. Clinging to old methods simply because they worked before is a path to irrelevance and failure. Ivan wasn't the best general of his era by any traditional measure, didn't personally possess the greatest tactical genius or inspiring battlefield charisma. But he was willing to learn from failure, to admit when old methods didn't work, to adopt new technology even when it was foreign and unfamiliar and required hiring foreigners, which wounded Russian pride, to completely change methods when old ones failed repeatedly. That intellectual flexibility and determination, that willingness to say, "I was wrong, let's try something different," is why he succeeded when so many before him had failed, using the same tired approaches. Legends and heroic stories, the tales that get told and retold around fires and in books, tell of brave warriors and glorious battles decided by courage in a single heroic moment, by the strength of one man's arm or the brilliance of one tactical decision in the heat of combat. But the reality of history, the truth that emerges when you study what actually happened rather than accepting the myths and legends, is that most battles are actually decided by boring, unglamorous things, like logistics, supply lines, and meticulous preparation that no one wants to hear about because it's not exciting. Ivan won at Kazan, not primarily because he had a bigger army than previous attempts, though he certainly did command more troops. He didn't win because Russian soldiers were braver or stronger. They'd been brave in the 10 previous failed attempts, too. He won because he built Sviazhsk, an unglamorous forward base that nobody writes songs about, but which solved the critical supply problem that had doomed every previous siege when armies ran out of food and ammunition. He won because he spent months, years really when you count all the planning, preparing, training soldiers in new tactics, gathering weapons and ammunition from across his realm, and even importing them from Europe. Planning every detail of the campaign down to the number of wagons needed for supplies, and the amount of gunpowder required. In our own lives, whether we're building businesses, pursuing careers, creating art, or working toward any significant goal, the same principle holds true. Success usually doesn't come from grand dramatic moments, from sudden inspiration striking like lightning, or from lucky breaks that fall from the sky. It comes from meticulous preparation that no one sees, from consistent hard work day after day when no one is watching, from persistence over time when results don't come immediately. The victory looks sudden to outside observers who only see the final moment of triumph, but it's actually the result of countless hours of preparation and effort that no one saw or appreciated at the time. For Moscow and the Russian people, ordinary citizens who had lived under the shadow of Mongol power for their entire lives and whose grandparents had lived under that same shadow, Kazan's fall was a glorious beginning, the dawn of a new era. It was the first step toward becoming a great power that would eventually rival and surpass the great empires of Europe. It was liberation from centuries of humiliation. It was proof that Russians could stand equal to any nation. It was a moment of pride and joy. For the Tatars and other peoples of Kazan, those same events were a tragic ending, the loss of independence that their grandfathers had fought to maintain, the suppression of culture that had flourished for over a century, the start of centuries under foreign rule where their language would be discouraged, their religion suppressed, their children taught that their heritage was something to be ashamed of. It was the end of a world, the death of a dream of independence. History isn't a simple story of good versus evil, of heroes versus villains, of progress versus backwardness. It's infinitely more complex than that, more nuanced, more tragic. Every major event has winners and losers, people celebrating in the streets and people mourning in their homes, voices speaking proudly, and voices being silenced by force or fear. It's critically important that when we study history, we don't just celebrate the victors and ignore everyone else as if they didn't matter. We should also remember those who lost, the cultures that disappeared or were suppressed, or were forced to hide their traditions, the voices that were silenced by conquest and never got to tell their side of the story. Because real history isn't ultimately about kingdoms and empires and borders on maps, about grand strategies and geopolitical movements. It's about people, individual human beings with names and families who lived, loved, hoped, struggled, and died in these defining moments. They had children they worried about. They had dreams for the future. They had fears and joys and ordinary daily concerns. And their stories matter too, deserve to be remembered too, even when they ended in defeat and tragedy rather than triumph. On October the 2nd, 1552, on a commanding hill overlooking the mighty Volga River where it curves through the landscape, a city fell in flames and blood and the screams of dying men. And with it, the last substantial legacy of the Mongol Empire in Europe, the final echo of Genghis Khan's conquests, ended forever after centuries of dominance. But what rose from those ashes, from that destruction and death, was something entirely new and unprecedented. A multi-ethnic empire that would eventually expand relentlessly from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the distant east, from the frozen Arctic, where few could survive in the north, to Central Asia with its ancient cities in the south. An empire that would become the largest continuous land empire the world had ever seen, larger even than the Mongol Empire at its peak. the story of Kazan reminds us powerfully that history is made in defining moments, in pivotal events that echo through centuries and shape the lives of people not yet born, events whose consequences ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Moments when leaders face difficult choices with imperfect information and must decide the fate of nations. Moments when technology fundamentally changes the playing field and old certainties become obsolete, when what everyone knew to be true suddenly isn't true anymore. Moments when old empires, no matter how mighty they once were or how permanent they seemed, give way to new ones in violent transformation. It also reminds us powerfully and soberly that such moments of transformation always have a cost, often a terrible cost, that gets forgotten in celebrations of victory. For every victory celebration with cheering crowds and heroic songs, there's a funeral with quiet weeping. For every new beginning full of hope, there's an ending full of sorrow. For every winner writing history books, there are losers whose stories are forgotten or deliberately erased. Now, tell me honestly, what struck you most powerfully about this story of conquest and tragedy, of technological change and human cost? Was it Ivan's innovative engineering and his willingness to adopt new technology, even when it meant challenging tradition? Was it the desperate courage of Kazan's defenders, fighting for their culture and independence against impossible odds, knowing they would lose but fighting anyway? Or was it the long-term consequences that rippled across centuries, shaping the world we live in today in ways most people never think about? Leave your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what resonated with you. And if you genuinely enjoyed this video and learned something new about this crucial moment in history, hit that like button to help others discover this story. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dive history content, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss more deep dive history stories like this one that explore the moments that changed everything. Because history isn't just about the past, about memorizing dates and names for tests and then forgetting them. It's about understanding how we got here as a species, as civilizations that rose and fell, and maybe, if we're wise enough to learn from the mistakes and triumphs of those who came before us, where we're headed next, and how to avoid repeating the worst of our past. Thanks for watching. And remember this fundamental truth that applies to empires and individuals alike. Every great empire begins with a decision, a choice, a moment of courage or desperation, when everything changes forever and the world is never quite the same again. One person makes a choice, and history turns on that choice like a door swinging on its hinges. See you in the next one, where we'll explore another moment that changed the world.